He walked into that courtroom with pride, a soldier who had served his country through deserts and danger, a man who had stood under gunfire to defend the very freedoms this room represented. But the silence was thick, the air electric with judgment. Then it came a voice sharp enough to cut steel. It wasn't there to honor him. It was there to dismantle him. And within minutes, his years of service, his medals, his sacrifices, all would be used against him. What happened next wasn't just an insult. It was a moment that would expose something far deeper, far uglier, than anyone in that room expected. For over a decade, Sergeant Michael Hayes had worn the uniform with honor. From the scorching sands of Iraq to the tense, watchful nights in Afghanistan, he had been there not for glory, but for the man beside him. Back home, life had been quieter, but not easier. The war had left invisible marks. Still, he built a routine. Early mornings, long runs, helping veterans find work. That sense of discipline and purpose kept him steady. The courtroom wasn't where he expected to be, but today, he was here as a witness. A fellow soldier, a friend, was fighting a legal battle that could destroy his life. Hayes had been called to testify to his character, to tell the truth. The building smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper. The echo of heels on marble carried through the corridors as lawyers prepared their cases. Hayes sat tall, medals pinned neatly to his chest, his uniform crisp. He thought it would be straightforward. Tell the truth. Support a brother in arms. Go home. But somewhere behind the polished legal smiles, there was a plan. One that had nothing to do with justice, and everything to do with breaking him down in front of everyone. It began with tone. Not the words, not yet, but the tone. The opposing attorney, a woman with sharp eyes and sharper words, leaned on the podium with a smirk that didn't belong in a court of law. Her questions were precise, almost surgical, but they weren't aimed at the case, they were aimed at him. "Sergeant Hayes," she began, flipping through papers, "how many times have you been disciplined in your career?" His brow furrowed. "None, ma'am." A slight smile. "None? Not once for misconduct? Not even off duty?" The implication was clear. The way she held the pause, letting the silence stretch, was deliberate. The jury shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. She moved on, but not forward. Her questions kept circling back to his deployments, his actions overseas, his decisions under stress. Each query had the same undertone, that his uniform was a cover, not a badge of honor. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. The judge's gavel tapped once. "Proceed." Then came the twist. She began pulling in unrelated reports, incidents involving other soldiers in his unit, and framing them as if they were reflections of his own character. He wanted to defend himself, to push back, but every attempt was cut short by her next calculated strike. The air grew heavy. Every eye was on him, and with each question, he could feel the room's respect for him shrinking. And then the moment that made his stomach knot. She leaned in and asked, "Would you agree, Sergeant, that men like you sometimes believe the rules don't apply to them?" He stared at her, the weight of every battlefield he'd stood on, pressing into this one moment. But before he could answer, she moved on, leaving the question hanging poison in the air. And then it happened, the blow she'd been building toward. She placed her papers down, looked him dead in the eye, and said, her voice ringing through the room, "Your service doesn't make you above the law, Sergeant. In fact, maybe it's made you think you can get away with anything." The gallery gasped. Someone whispered, "That's out of line." The judge shifted uncomfortably, but didn't intervene. Hayes sat motionless, but inside a storm raged. His pulse pounded in his ears. Decades of service, years of sacrifice, the friends he'd buried reduced to a single cutting sentence. He wanted to speak, to remind her and everyone of the nights he'd spent under enemy fire, so they could live without fear. But the courtroom was not a battlefield where strength could be shown openly. Every second after her words felt longer, heavier. The jury's eyes told a story of doubt. Cameras from the press captured every twitch, every swallow. In that instant, Hayes understood. This was never about the truth of the case. This was about stripping him of his dignity, piece by piece, until the uniform on his back felt like a target instead of armor. The gavel struck. Next question. The trial continued, the world outside moving on, as if nothing had happened. But for Sergeant Hayes, that moment was carved into his memory. It wasn't just the sting of personal insult. It was the deeper wound of realizing that even in the country he had fought to protect, there were battles that no amount of training could prepare him for. When he left the courthouse that day, the crispness of his uniform felt heavier. The medals pinned to his chest seemed to burn against his skin, reminders of service that some would twist into something else. The story made the news for a week. Opinion pieces debated whether the attorney had crossed a line. But then, as with so many stories of quiet injustice, the world looked away. Hayes didn't. He carried that day with him not as a scar, but as a reminder that the fight for respect, for dignity, for fairness wasn't over when the battlefield was left behind. And maybe that's the harshest truth of all. For some soldiers, the most painful war begins the moment they come home. How many more will have to fight it before the world starts listening?